mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Republika ng Pilipinas.
For the healers who found the courage to tell the world their truths about the Battle of Manila. For the children who cried in their beds at night, reliving the horrors of what they had seen done to family and loved ones. For the mothers and fathers who tried to explain the unexplainable, Lord, hear our prayer. For all the children who have died before their time. For the soldiers who allowed their uniform to strip them of their humanity. For the redemption of the souls of both victim and perpetrator. For those who commit themselves to the forgiveness of sins. Lord, hear our prayer. Amen.
We will remember those who fell in the night, so we may rise to see the dawn. They gave us life and liberty, as well as the duty to cherish and defend them, like they did 75 years ago. In the present, let us work for the peace that our forebears fought and died for.
Some of the people who survived the battle and their descendants were able to identify, bury, and mourn their lost family members. My family is included among those. But the great majority of those killed never had that opportunity. The dead were buried in mass graves, never to know the sanctity of hallowed ground, and were instead pushed into pits by bulldozers to prevent disease, since their bodies were decomposing after a month-long battle. Those so-called burial sites are located all over the city of Manila. Today, we must be their messengers. We must share their stories. We must give them the identity for today. In the words of Elie Wiesel, Nobel laureate, professor and Holocaust survivors, when speaking about the Holocaust and civilian deaths of the Second World War, he said, quote, "If one forgets the dead, it is like betraying them again." He also said, "Memory has become the sacred duty of people of goodwill. The dead here have had no voice. Whole families disappeared from this earth in this battle. We must be their memories, and we must be their history. We must keep them alive that way."
Manila wasn't supposed to be fought over and razed to the ground when Japan swiftly and successfully invaded the Philippines in 1941. USAF Commander Douglas MacArthur promptly declared Manila an open city to spare it from needless destruction. 14th Area Army Commander Tomoyuki Yamashita also thought of the same in 1945. As he knew, he did not have the manpower and resources to defend the city from the returning Americans. Both gentlemen were considered the best products of the respective countries' military academies. They knew well of the convention of fighting battles away from civilian settlements and the human treatment of non-combatants long before they were formally codified in the Geneva Conventions. But MacArthur and Yamashita's view were not shared by some of their subordinates on the ground. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi of the Manila garrison is strongly influenced by Bushido's principle of choosing honorable death than shameful surrender, decided to hold over and fought to the last man instructing those under his command to do the same. The Americans under General Walter Kruger originally were only fighting out of sense of patriotic duty to their country. But after learning the cruel treatment of their comrades who suffered under the Japanese in the Bataan Death March and in various prisoners of war camps, everything became personal and they marched into Manila with a purpose of vengeance. Thus, in a span of 1 month, Manila was subjected to intense gunfire, shelling, and arson from both sides, with civilian population, or more than 500,000, caught in the crossfire. Many buildings which once dominated the skyline were reduced to rubble. The streets which were once bustling with activity fell silent. Dead bodies, or the remaining parts thereof, were everywhere. Some residents tried to flee, but unfortunately, they were met with either sharp nails from exploding mortars, debris from crashing buildings, or bayonet from the Japanese soldiers who did not bother to distinguish civilians from combatants. Basically, when we say memorare, we're telling everyone to remember, in the sense that it's just to recall a particular memory in mind, but make sure that no one does not forget it. We are gathered here today in the same way we gathered for the past few years, for the purpose of remembrance. Human memory is fragile, and people are prone to forgetfulness, especially when it concerns tragedy and loss. I know that it is very disgusting to reminisce scenes of dead bodies and burning buildings, sounds of explosions, screams of women being helplessly abused. But we need to remember. We need to ensure that nobody ever forgets. The memory of a terrible ordeal of our city and our nation as a whole was subjected to. We should also strive in great length to keep the proverbial flame alive, to make sure that those fortunate enough to be born after the war incur and retain awareness of the tragedy that they did not witness.
Magandang umaga po. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor to be here as a Japanese who invaded the Philippines 75 years ago. First of all, I would like to share my personal experience back in the year 2000 when I was a university student in Japan. My professor, Mr. Amemiya, wanted his student to be exposed to the reality of the war, what happened here in the Philippines. So he had been bringing Japanese students every year for about 20 years, and I was the 14th batch in the year 2000. It was really life-changing experience for me. I've met so sad stories. One lady came up to me and said, "I didn't want to see any Japanese. Why you came here?" Her husband was captured by a Japanese soldier and never came back. She had anger and hatred in her heart. And the other day, we visited a mayor's office in Isabela City. While we introduced ourselves and we were explaining the purpose of the visit, the mayor, Emilio Montalvo, was full in tears. And he said he was the victim of the Battle of Manila. His father was bayoneted in front of him and died. And also his families and relatives were killed in front of him. It was really heartbreaking to know the reality of the war. Of course, we had preliminary studies in Japan and learned what happened here in the Philippines, but the reality was more cruel than what we had imagined. After the trip, when I came back to Japan, I decided to meet former soldiers who was stationed here in the Philippines because I wanted to know why they were so cruel. I've been interviewing more than 300 Japanese soldiers in Japan, and some of them really regretted what they had done. Some of them said they still have nightmares. I thought the war makes men crazy. Unfortunately, today we do not represent the Japanese government and not being directly responsible for all those crimes. Nonetheless, we, as their descendants, would like to apologize to you humbly for what our fathers did. And last, I need to talk about Mr. Edgar Cron and James Liddon, who passed away last year. It is really sad to know that the news for me because I met him in the year 2007, and he taught me a lot. He taught me about the Battle of Manila and the cruelty of the war. And of course, I have to mention about Ambassador Rocha, who passed away in 2015. And of course, other prominent people who had to go through the war. If they were here, maybe they might ask me, please don't forget the tragedy. So not to forget the tragedy, I believe the education is the key. We, Bridge for Peace, is trying to educate the Japanese younger generation back in Japan. I've been organizing this organization, now it's 15 years now, and many young Japanese generations started to join this advocacy. Some of them became teachers, and the others became newspaper reporters saying that they would like to pass on the history. Not yet, but maybe in the future, one of them might become a government officer, and I hope in the future they will come here to officially apologize as a Japanese government. That is also my hope. And I would like to see the world without any war in any country. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much.
These are the voices that were from the generation of people who were eyewitnesses to the dark chapter in our history. We should not disregard these voices, for they are the ones who know our history and why we are enjoying the liberties we now enjoy. Those voices must also be heard in the context of a need for us to identify why peace, nationalism, and sense of pride as Filipinos must be manifested and maintained. My own granduncle, Carlos P. Romulo, was one such voice. He was a person during the Second World War who was an eyewitness and, as he stated in his book, walked with heroes. In an essay, former Secretary Romulo wrote, "Let us teach our people again to be proud that they are Filipinos. Let us teach them to realize anew that being a Filipino means having as rich and noble a heritage of language, culture, patriotism, and heroic deeds as any nation on earth.